Hi, everyone. Today we'll be presenting on technical collaboration, federal and local success stories in FEMA Region 10. I am Soumya Sagarika, and I have with me Farron Affleck, who will be also co-presenting. So we wanted to highlight some projects in Region 10, and through these projects wanted to give examples of how communities can provide technical input in the risk map process, since we heavily collaborated with the communities here, and some ideas on how to approach to find solutions that are catered to each project, and how to get to the win-win situation for all the stakeholders involved. So the first project we are going to cover is Middle Columbia Hood project, which is in Oregon. This is in North Central Oregon, an hour or two east of Portland. This project involves 3 counties, Hood River County, Wasco County, and Sherman County. We had 600 miles of riverine study done here, and it covered around 9 communities, so it's a lot of coordination that went into this project. So for this project, FEMA took a phased approach for studying the risk associated with flooding. The first thing they did was, or they call it phase 1. So phase 1 involved doing a basic base level engineering analysis. You can see Region 10 definitely has a little higher criteria for their BLE. It's very comparable to Zone A approximate, and this study was done in 2016, where they funded it, and whatever results that came out of the study, that was shared with the communities, and the communities were asked to provide their feedback. After taking the feedback from the communities, the region funded the phase 2, which adds further refinement to these initial models and improves it and brings it to a Zone A or approximate level. And then again, these were shared to the communities. This was done in 2018. The results were shared, and the communities were again given an opportunity to provide their feedback, look at the data, see if there were some areas they wanted to upgrade. And from that feedback, FEMA was able to fund the phase 3 of this project, which improved some of these models to a detail level, or if the community had identified a new area that they wanted to develop, also bring that on board and do a higher detail level of analysis. To assist with this phased approach, FEMA adopted their geo platform that the region has and used that to communicate the different developments in this project cycle. So you can see the web viewer for this project has several tabs, and the first tab is the baseline of the existing flood maps. It showcases the effective flood hazard area, and the communities, if they're interested in a particular area, they can use this, zoom into their area of concern, and kind of get some information. This provides a basic information of the zone designation and when the effective study was done. Coming to the next tab, after the phase 1 analysis, the results were posted on this platform, and the communities could provide feedback as well. So some of the additional stuff that was done in between the phase 1 analysis and getting the feedback, FEMA tried to prioritize internally, looking at the phase 1 results, if a stream was a higher risk, or an area was a higher risk, depending on the number of structures that were affected, and if some of the areas were a lower concern for the communities. For example, if a stream is in a very rural area, there are no structures affected, that was prioritized as low, and similarly medium or high prioritization. And during this assessment, the structures were also assessed. For example, if it was seen that a structure could back up a lot of water, that was given a higher priority. And depending on the number of buildings that was affected too, the priority level would change. So this initial assessment was provided to the communities along with the results from phase 1, and we asked for their input and feedback on what they thought and if we captured everything correctly. And then the community provided their feedback. So the tab, the third tab or the step 2 kind of captures that. The communities were able to identify gaps that were not captured previously. And if they could confirm if the initial assessment that was done on the stream priorities, they were correct as per their needs, or they were able to provide feedback if there is future development that FEMA didn't consider, they were able to add those or change the priorities by leveling it up or down. Similarly, they also were able to provide feedback on structures, and most of the initial assessment, they confirmed that the assessments were right, and they were also able to, this back and forth kind of helped them provide information from their local knowledge, some as-built information, and FEMA also funded for the phase 2 approach to get some field measure data, and the communities were also able to supplement by providing resources. They sent their own surveyors to help with the data collection. That kind of helped improve a lot of the technical aspects of the modeling. So this again comes back to the same web viewer. You can see after the tab 2, tab 3 highlights or showcases the results from the phase 2 analysis. Similar to the previous tabs, there is information, and the communities could zoom in and like click on a spot, and this kind of shows when the analysis was completed. They could also get the water surface elevation from here. And on the left corner in the bottom, so FEMA also funded phase 3, and so the phase 3 scoping was also included in this tab. They could see the layout of the survey locations that were funded, and they could use this tool to capture all the information instead of like going through a lot of. This tool helped improve that engagement a lot. And let's say if there was someone who was not initially present during the first few phases of the project, they could easily use this and be catched up about this project cycle. It's a lot of advantages of this phased approach. Definitely community concerns were captured early on, since they had more opportunities to provide their feedback compared to a typical project of just discovery and a flood risk review meeting. There was a lot more back and forth with this phased approach. We definitely saw the communities more engaged as they were willing to provide resources to collect information, and they were also able to provide existing models and information. Compared to a typical project, it was the communication was much improved, and modeling-wise, that helped enhance the models better. And the web viewer, like I said, helped improve the communication with the stakeholders as well. Since this is a phased approach, there are challenges, like it goes into a longer project cycle. But it also eliminates any unexpected concerns that were not captured with a typical project. So anything that comes in an appeal period, those things would have been already communicated. Right now with this project, we are done with the phase 3, and we will be updating the web viewer with another tab with new maps. And the next step is to take it to the preliminary phase. And it definitely FEMA feels very confident that for three of the counties and the number of communities involved, it's been a very smooth process so far. With this, I'm going to hand it over to Farron Affleck for the next project.
Hi, thank you, Soumya. So the next project we're going to talk about is in the Teton Watershed in Idaho. This project actually, this is in a rural area of Idaho, and it's something that it's a project we started back in 2014. We got going with the engineering. So this actually occurred prior to the phased approach that the region was taking that Soumya described. At the time we kicked the project off, there weren't really a lot of concerns there were some concerns brought up, but there weren't a lot of technical things that were brought up at the meetings. You know, we were aware, and they identified there was a dam break from that was significant that flooded the area, much greater than a 100-year event. They had some levees that were not accredited, and we had discussed like how those would have to be treated. There is a large AO zone shown in the picture on the right. That in that olive color is a large AO zone that really didn't have a lot of technical backing. There's no effective model or anything to look at to see how that AO zone was generated. And so really with that was kind of all the information we had. And so we had an idea that we would probably need to do a two-dimensional modeling approach here and see what we get, right? And then for their neighboring county, Teton County, the only technical thing that came up during the kickoff was some question about the USGS regression equations and whether they're, reliable or something that you can trust in that area of Idaho. So looking a little bit more into Madison County, when, like I said, we knew we needed to do something with two-dimensional modeling. We kind of expected it to be complicated, and we dove in and went for it, right? And so this was quite a while back, and so with the standards at the time and the technology available at the time, we did the best we could, and we came up with a floodway that was a floodplain and floodway that were quite large, and really took the county back. So this is what we issued. This is what we issued at the FRR meeting. So the red would be zone A, E, and then the yellow would be floodway. They gave us comments, and we, for the most part, resolved the technical comments that they gave us. There were a lot of other comments that weren't, heavy technical comments that I guess, could have just worked around and just moved forward. But rather than that, we with FEMA recognizing that we needed to come up, this is not a typical situation, and we needed to come up with something that all parties could feel good about. And if the floodplain needs to be this wide, so be it. But we need to make sure that the communities can get behind that and recognize the risk that they're dealing with. Or, if our models need to be refined, then that's even better, right? So we had finished the engineering meeting, and the next step would have been to move on to preliminary mapping. But instead of doing that, we slowed down, and we had several meetings working with the communities, some in person, some virtual, a lot of phone calls with the county floodplain administrator, and try to do our best to just work together on this thing, help them understand the technical aspects that they weren't so familiar with, and then help us understand the physical conditions out there, right? So some of the solutions we came to were switching from Flow 2D to HEC-RAS 2D. This would allow the county to be able to work with the model. They didn't have a license of Flow 2D, and It would allow for faster run times. So this was something that we didn't have at the beginning of the project, right? But now that HEC-RAS 2D had come out, we all kind of agreed it was the right decision to switch for this situation. And then the county was offering up to help us. They took us around to tour the area, and they helped point out a lot of canals and situations there. And then after we went home, they still stayed out in the field and collected more information about the canals. And they also dug into some data and found some good information about a 2010 flood event that could help us calibrate our data, something we really didn't have. And so these were the things we came to, right? We'll get a better model, and we'll get better data, and we'll make a refinement, right? And so we're not done yet, but I think by the time we get done with this working together, we're all, whatever the result comes out to be, we'll all feel much better about, much more confident in what we're producing, and the community will be able to regulate to it a little easier with a settled stomach. In Teton County, their neighbor, we really didn't have the two-dimensional problems that Madison County had. But as I had pointed out earlier, there was some question about the hydrology coming out of regression. So for this project, we had moved forward all the way to prelims because there really weren't, at the time, any technical concerns that were, we could get around. We were using the best available data at the time. But after prelims, around the time of issuing prelims, we had new USGS published a new regression report with new equations. And so that was something to look into, right? And then also looking more into the LiDAR data, the LiDAR had been flown coincidentally. There was a high flow period at the time that they flew the LiDAR. And so there was some concern that the LiDAR could have been penetrating deeper or more into the channels. So regardless, there were some things that the county thought could be refined. And so this was occurring around the appeal period. They brought this up to FEMA and with the appeal period, and we all agreed, let's make this better, right? So let's back up a little bit and refine these models with hydrology that we can stand behind a little bit more, and then also with the county was willing to go out and get new LiDAR to improve the study. And so again, this is something where we're not all done, but we feel like this collaboration will help us produce a product that is more defensible, that the county can stand behind and regulate to. So the next project to talk about is the Nisqually River watershed in Washington. So this drains a portion of Mount Rainier down to the Puget Sound. When we kicked off the project, or at the beginning of the project, the communities came to us with a lot of information and a lot of opinions. They, Pierce County and Thurston County are all over it. They know what's going on in their watershed, and they came to us and said, hey, look, number one, there's this alder reservoir on Nisqually River that it's a hydroelectric dam, but it's really not intended for flood control. So it's this big dam that does impact flows, but can't be relied on to reduce flood risk. So we really don't want to have it modeled as providing a reduction in risk. And so we recognized that, and we said, okay, let's work with you to figure out a way to model this stream with and remove that from the equation. That actually, we have a side presentation that Anna Simos is doing with this conference where she talks all about it. And so I'm not going to get into the weeds on that one, but I encourage you to go check it out. It should be pretty interesting. Some other things that came up were there were various LiDAR data sets to consider, different counties, different years, and they helped us sort that out and figure out which data was the best data to use. We were working on laying out our survey, and we said, hey, let's have a conversation with the county and make sure we're not missing something, right? So they helped us in the areas of most concern, make sure that we're capturing the bathymetry where it needs to be captured. And then a big one is next to the Alder Reservoir, probably the next biggest one was this 1996 flood event was a substantial event. It was near or at a 100-year event for them. And so they had lots of good data. They had high water marks along the Nisqually River and some of its tributaries. They had aerial photography that they gave us that had captured the aerial photography from close to the time of the peak. And so we were able to take those high water marks and those aerials and overlay them with our model results and calibrate our model to do a better job of lining up with what they observed. And that made us very confident that, you know, hey, we can't be too far off here if we're reproducing these results. Also, so then that was all data that they gave us at the very beginning. They knew right away they wanted to give it to us, and it was great. And then during the project, we're working through this thing, and we would have check-ins with them and collaborate a little bit, and they'd say, hey, we need to let you know about this or that. And so a few things that came up that were great to get were they identified an area of future development where they were thinking, hey, there's going to be some development potential in this area. So we identified that as a need, right? And then we're in the middle of the modeling, and they came to us and say, hey, remember that 1996 event? There were some things we didn't tell you about, and we want to make sure you do capture them, right? So they showed us areas where flow was moving that, you know, wanted to be sure our model was capturing, and that helped us calibrate our data. It's anecdotal, you know, but it was still beneficial to us. And then at the very end of the project, unfortunately, there was a pretty big flood event this year in February where we were getting about done wrapping up our project, and then this happened. There was about a 10-year event on the Nisqually River. And so we were pretty close to being done, but the county hurried up and went out and gathered a bunch of pictures and high water marks and gave them to us, and we were able to check them against our data, right? And against our 10-year event and say, hey, is this performing pretty close to what they just observed? And it seemed to be, and that gave us a lot of confidence in what we had. So it helped us validate what we had produced. So with this project, it's been great because the community was engaged from the beginning, and then and provided us good technical information from the start, right? And then throughout the project, as we're checking in with them, they were always looking for more things they could give us to make our data better. And at some point, you got to cut it off. But it really was great to be getting things along the way to really make sure we're doing a good job, you know, and then that they can have something to regulate to at the end that they can trust. So at the end, I felt like this was we came up with something everybody felt pretty good about. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Soumya. Thank you.
Thanks, Farron. To conclude this presentation, we hope that through these 3 project cases, it shows examples of different ways to achieve technical collaboration between communities and FEMA. Early identification of concerns of the communities is always the key. The earlier you identify them, and then FEMA can work around to either find a process to resolve it or communicate to get more information that the communities can either supplement through local knowledge. If the communities can have their hands on the terrain or LiDAR, they can provide information like, hey, this LiDAR date is not accurate, or that's not how the current scenario or the situation is. It's not existing right anymore. They can supplement information by providing as-bills, by providing field measurements, high water marks, any historic information on flooding, just by supplementing resources as well. Like we saw in Middle Columbia Hood, just helping FEMA with surveyors was a big improvement, or a big thing that helped improve the modeling overall. Along with providing data and providing feedback, they also need to understand there are limitations in this flood map process. Not every problem can be solved, though there is flexibility, but there are limitations on the resources that FEMA can allocate, and they also have to meet the standard requirements. So sometimes if a problem is not solved or concern is not met, there are processes of LOMAR that can also supplement any restudies if needed. And then trying to come to the win-win situation where by collaborating, the communities can provide information and feedback early on that helps FEMA focus their resources and create a better product that is acceptable and helpful for the communities. With this, we'll open it up for questions.
Hi, and thank you for attending this presentation of the ASFPM 2020 conference. My name is Isaac Allen, and I'm a Water Resources Engineer with AECOM. Today I'll be presenting on hot and cold flooding, cool flood risk products for communities. And I promise that's the last bad pun that's used throughout the rest of the presentation. This presentation focuses on work that was completed by AECOM for the Colorado Water Conservation Board as part of a risk map study completed in the Animas River watershed. It details a number of non-regulatory products that were tailored specifically to the communities within the Animas River watershed to help them better understand different aspects of risk that impact them. To start off, I wanted to give some background information about the location of the projects you'll hear throughout this presentation, as well as some additional information on the purpose of these projects. So starting with the project locations. The Animas River watershed, which contains all areas studied, is located in southwestern Colorado, as you can see in the top right corner of the screen. The Animas River risk map study covered a large portion of the Animas River drainage, which spanned across several Huc 8 watersheds. For this part of the project, however, we focused in on two specific areas. The first was around Silverton, Colorado, to the north of the Animas River watershed. The studies included studies on Cement Creek, Mineral Creek, as well as the Animas River. The second area that we focused on was near Durango, Colorado, and we studied Junction Creek and Hermosa Creek, which are both tributaries to the Animas River. These specific streams were identified based on conversations with community officials, which I'll detail later. A little bit more on the purpose of this project. As I mentioned in the introduction slide, the main goal of this was to provide the communities that are impacted by flooding on the Animas River with some additional information about the risks that they might be exposed to. This covered a suite of products that aren't traditionally included with a normal risk map study. The second major purpose was to set an example for future risk map studies that are conducted throughout the state. The idea here is that when we go into a community, we can offer up examples of past studies that have been done, in addition to the traditional flood risk study, to better understand how we can help inform the public there and inform people who are making decisions as it pertains to development and etc. The idea is that this study in the Animas River watershed will serve as somewhat of a framework for how additional non-regulatory products can be tacked on for other risk map studies in Colorado. Let's move now to the non-regulatory products that were actually included with the risk map study. As I mentioned, there were a number of different things that we looked at based on conversations with the communities. The first was post-fire flooding. This was selected based on conversations with the town of Durango because of a devastating wildfire, the 416 fire, that was experienced the year prior to starting the risk map study. The town was specifically interested in knowing how post-burn conditions might potentially impact their risk of flooding. The second product that we included was ice jam analysis. In the town of Silverton, there's several documented locations of historical ice jams. The community was interested in learning more about how those ice jams in the winter may be impacting flooding during the spring runoff season. The third that was included was snowmelt analysis. This wasn't tied with the ice jam flooding, but instead looked specifically at the volume of snowmelt that ran off during the spring, and specifically looked at conditions where you have high snowpack late into the spring, which may cause spring flooding that has impacts within a community. Finally, the last thing we looked at was a travel time estimator. This was specifically tied to the Gold King mine disaster, which you may have heard on the news. This was essentially a mine release that got into the Animas River watershed and impacted some of the communities downstream. To look more specifically at this case, we proposed putting together a travel time estimator, which essentially looked at the average time it would take for water to move from between two different points in the watershed. This gave the communities an idea of how long it might take any number of different things from moving from upstream to downstream locations such as water treatment inlets that they have specific interest in. Once I get through those 4 non-regulatory products, we'll have some time for questions on each of them. A quick other note, all these non-regulatory products were a great way of identifying mitigation actions that the communities could potentially take to help reduce their risk from these different sources as well as flooding. After completing all these analysis, we documented these different risk drivers in the FEMA Mitigation Action Tracker so that they were documented for future use. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, all the non-regulatory products included were driven based on conversations with the communities. In August of 2016, we met with a number of communities as part of the discovery phase of the risk map study. Note that August 2016 was post the gold mine King release. During those conversations, we discussed a number of different hazards that had been identified by the communities. These communities included San Juan County and the town of Silverton, La Plata County and the city of Durango, and also the Southern Ute Indian tribe. All of these different partners had a lot of valuable input and a lot of valuable contributions in determining how to best evaluate these different sources of risk and give them information that could be used in the future to help them alleviate these risks. The first non-regulatory product that I want to go over is the post-fire flooding that was evaluated. This was evaluated for both Hermosa Creek and Junction Creek outside of the town of Durango, Colorado. As I move through each of these different non-regulatory products, note that I'm not going to describe every detail of the analysis because there isn't enough time to do that. Instead, I'm going to highlight some of the key inputs to these analyses and try and touch on some of the key things that were transferred over to the communities for them to better understand these sources of risk. The post-fire flooding analysis was specifically requested by La Plata County and the city of Durango, which were the 2 communities that were most impacted by the 416 wildfire. The 416 fire burned a large portion of Hermosa Creek as well as some of the Junction Creek watersheds. Both watersheds are heavily forested, and at the downstream end, there's development that can be impacted by flooding conditions. A few more details about the 416 fire. It burned for approximately a month in the summer of 2018 and burned nearly 57,000 acres. Of that, most of it was in the Hermosa Creek watershed, which is shown to the image on the right. Note that wildfire risk in Colorado has caught a lot of attention recently, and one of the factors that plays into that is beetle kill, which continues to move from the south of Colorado and destroy a number of the forests that leave them susceptible to burning conditions. The first thing that was done for the post-fire analysis was to identify the burn scenarios that we were going to evaluate. We elected to look at 3 different scenarios. Note that 2 of these applied to the Junction Creek watershed, while all 3 applied to the Hermosa Creek watershed. The first of these 3 scenarios was the extent of the 416 fire. We were able to obtain burn condition data following the fire and use that footprint to modify the conditions within the watershed from the 416 event. The second scenario we looked at was the high-risk zones that had been identified by the Colorado State Forest Service to take some impact or some look into future burn scenarios and the areas that may be most susceptible to burn conditions. Finally, we looked at what might be deemed ultra-conservative full burn scenario within each of the watersheds to hopefully get an idea of what the worst case scenario would be for flood enhanced by post-burn conditions. The biggest component of the post-fire flood study was updating the hydrology based on the burn conditions. The base unburned condition was based off of hydrology completed as part of the risk map study, which used gauge analyses for both Hermosa and Junction Creeks. Using those gauge results, a HEC-HMS model was set up, and the curve numbers input into the HMS model were calibrated to match the gauge results. That was used to establish the base condition. Using that HMS model, the curve numbers were then adjusted to represent the post-burn conditions. There are a number of different options available for modifying the curve numbers, but we selected a study that was done by the United States Department of Agriculture, which was a case study for an area in Colorado. This study used a number of different factors to identify the appropriate curve number that should be used for the post-burn condition. That was based off burn severity, initial land cover type, as well as the pre-burn soil condition. After the modified curve numbers were selected, a new base and composite number was identified and used for the hydrology analyses. In addition to updating the curve numbers, we also looked at sediment bulking factors, which were also specified in that USDA study. We selected bulking factors between 1.09 and 1.12. Note that a bulking factor of about 1.25 is typically recognized as the transition between a flood flow and a debris flow. These next two slides show some of the results of the HEC-RAS models that were run off of the post-fire hydrology values discussed in the last slide. Note that we put together a number of different maps that were shown to the communities, but I've included one example for both Hermosa and Junction Creeks to get you an idea of what we passed along to them. The inundation boundaries that are shown on the figure to the right were based off of a HEC-RAS model set up for the risk map study with some minor modifications to account for the increase in the flows. To orient you to the figure a little bit, the blue floodplain that you can see is the base 1% unburned condition, whereas the orange and pink floodplains that are shown are the post-burn conditions that were run through the HEC-RAS model. You can see that the risk for both the 10% and 1% post-burn conditions increased pretty significantly for this specific map shown. This information was relayed to the communities to give them a sense of what additional structures might be at risk in the years immediately following a wildfire condition. Note this table at the bottom of the screen compares the hydrology values that were calculated in the HMS model. This gives you an idea of the relative increase that was seen for all the different scenarios that were evaluated, and also at the very bottom presents the difference from the existing condition to give you a sense of how much the flows actually increased. I'm not going to go through each value, but it gives you a good reference for how much the post-fire conditions can actually impact the flood risk in this area. This is a similar map established for Hermosa Creek. It shows us several different scenarios that were evaluated. In this case, the post-fire conditions actually created a number of split flow conditions that weren't seen in the main 1% analysis. This obviously brought a number of structures into additional risk, and this information was shared with the communities to give them a sense of how that changed under these post-fire conditions. Similar to the last slide, the table at the bottom there gives you an idea of how the hydrology values increased over the three different conditions that we looked at in the post-burn environment. The next thing that we looked at was ice jamming. This was specifically evaluated on both the Animas River and Cement Creek, which run through Silverton, Colorado. Ice jamming analysis was specifically requested by the town of Silverton, which has several locations with documented historical ice jams. These locations are flagged on the image to the bottom left. These locations are also shown in the U.S. Army Corps CREL Ice Jam database, which documents a number of locations with historical ice jams throughout the western United States and some parts of Canada. These locations were used to evaluate the reaches that were most susceptible to ice jamming in the future. These next couple slides very quickly go over the method that was used to identify or to perform the ice jamming analysis and to map the results. The first step was to separate the gauge record that we had available to only look at snowmelt events. This was done because ice jamming is only a concern during the spring when you have snowmelt runoff conditions. The second step was to approximate the ice thickness. We used the procedure listed out here, where the average ice thickness is approximated based off of the temperatures that were recorded at a weather station within Silverton, Colorado. Those temperatures are used to establish how thick the ice could get based on this Stefan equation listed on the screen. The next step was then to run the ice-forming flows through the HEC-RAS model. The ice-forming flows are essentially the flows that you would expect during the coldest part of the winter when ice forming is at its peak. Those flows are used to establish how wide the ice sheet can get, and then used in later stages to identify how that ice moves downstream. The next step is to identify the locations where jamming is possible. The image on the right shows one such location in the HEC-RAS model. These locations were generally identified where the ice sheet determined in step 3 on the previous slide showed that it could be anchored against either the left or right or both banks in the stream, forming an anchor for an ice jam to form. Once those ice jams form, they raise the water level and can potentially increase the risk of flooding. Once the locations of possible jamming spots were identified, different parameters were set for those ice jams. Those parameters were based off of values recommended in the HEC-RAS user manual, as well as some input from the Army Corps of Engineers. There were several different scenarios then run through the model to identify how the inundation boundaries changed based on the presence of ice jamming at different locations. Note that in some cases you can extend the analysis one step further and actually create a composite water surface elevation curve based off of the results of open water versus snowmelt or ice jam impacted conditions to see how those two sources of risk intertwine. In this case, we didn't use the ice jamming results for the regulatory flood maps, and so we didn't perform this step of analysis, but instead just looked at the inundation boundaries that were generated. These next couple slides show some of the results from the ice jamming analysis. This first slide shows one of the results for Cement Creek. Similar to the post-fire map that was shown, this map shows a comparison of the ice jamming results to the original 1% restudied risk map result to give them a sense of how the risk changed as a result of the ice jamming conditions. On the image to the right, the blue floodplain is the 1% condition with no ice jamming impacts, whereas the orange and pink or purple are the inundation boundaries when ice jamming is in place. You can see that in this case, the ice jamming impacts cause a number of additional structures to be in the flood risk areas. This is also a good example of one mitigation item that was identified for the community. You can see at the 14th Street Bridge, there's a significant ice jamming location, which causes the backup that increases in the inundation area. This is an example of a mitigation item that was passed along to the community and also entered into FEMA's mitigation action tracker to potentially identify one way to alleviate this source of risk through the Cement Creek area. This is another similar example for the Animas Creek portion that was studied. The coloring scheme on the image to the right is the same as the previous slide and shows that there was, similarly on the Animas River, some increase in the flood risk which was caused by ice jamming impacts. A couple of additional points I wanted to throw out there for the ice jamming study. The first is that we weren't able to find any water surface calibration data to use for this study. Because of the variability in how ice jams can form from year to year, it's highly recommended that some calibration is done. And since we weren't able to track down that data, that's one of the reasons why we elected to not use this ice jamming study as a regulatory product, but instead just use it as a non-regulatory product to give a community a sense of how risk could potentially change under one hypothetical jam scenario on each stream. We noted to them through our reports and through several meetings that these are conservative results and that further studies would need to be done to better understand ice jamming in the Cement Creek and Animas River watersheds. The next non-regulatory product we looked at was snowmelt analyses for both the Hermosa Basin and the Silverton Basin near the city of Durango. The snowmelt analyses were specifically requested because 2019, or I should say, the winter of 2019 was a high snowpack year that potentially would trigger higher than usual snowmelt flooding through both the Hermosa and Silverton areas. For example, on June 15th of 2019, two of the SNOTEL gauges in the area which record snowpack were at 970% and 1000% of their 30-year average. This is a little bit inflated because of the time of year, but it gives you a sense of how 2019 was an exceptional snow year in this area. These next couple slides go over the methods that were used for the two different areas evaluated. The similarities between the methods are they used accumulated Fahrenheit degree day methodology to perform temperature index modeling in HEC-HMS. They used simple basin schematics and they only modeled snowpack decay. They didn't take into account any accumulation or rain on snow events. In both cases, the models were calibrated and validated based off of historical data. Some of the key differences between the methods are listed here on the screen. For Hermosa Creek, SNOTEL data was used to approximate snow depth and area of coverage, and a relatively coarse time step was used to model the snowpack conditions. For Silverton, on the other hand, SNODAS data, which is essentially modeled grid data, was the primary source of input for the snowpack conditions, and these were confirmed with data available at the SNOTEL gauges. Silverton also uses a 6-hour model time step, so slightly reduced from the Hermosa analysis, and the models were calibrated to both snowpack and stream flow. Once the models were generated, we looked at a number of different prediction scenarios, including 3 different temperature scenarios, one with a warm year, one with an average year, and one with a cold year relative to historical temperature records. Using those different scenarios, we generated predictions throughout the spring to give the communities a sense of how the flood might look and when the peaks might be expected. This slide gives an idea of the outreach information that was provided to the communities. This example is from the Hermosa Creek analysis and shows the snowmelt decay that was projected over the last couple months of the snowmelt runoff period. The table that's on the right-hand side of the screen is a summary that was provided. It essentially shows the peak that was estimated for the different scenarios, as well as the expected date of the peak, and it also compares the peak flow against the recurrence intervals studied for the risk map portion. This gives an idea of the general magnitude of flooding that the community could expect under the 3 different scenarios evaluated. Here's a quick look at the actual conditions that were plotted against the projections following the snowmelt runoff season. The line in green there shows the actual data that was observed at the SNOTEL gauge and shows that there was some late season accumulation that occurred, but in general, the melt rate that was predicted on the snowmelt curve followed a similar slope to what was seen in the actual data, showing that the average or warm temperature scenario was close to what was seen during the snowmelt decay period. Here's another example from Mineral Creek, showing the snow water equivalent that was predicted in the model. Again, on this figure, the green line that's shown is the actual data compared against the different scenarios that were evaluated. As you can see, for the most part, that green line fell within the different scenarios that we had presented to the communities. Here's another look at some of the Mineral Creek output results. This is specifically looking at the stream flow. The graph on the screen right now shows the different scenarios that were evaluated. And again, the green line shows the actual data that was recorded at the gauge. As you can see, relative to the predictions, the actual data was quite a bit lower through the month of June, and then peaked at a similar time to what was seen in the predicted scenarios. Similar to the Hermosa result I showed, we prepared these summary tables to show some of the peak information, the peak expected date, and how the snowmelt flows stacked up against the risk map recurrence intervals. Here's an idea of how we did between the peak date, and the recurrence interval predicted versus the 2019 actual data. For the peak, a little bit off. For the range, right within the scenarios we predicted. And for the recurrence interval, close to the cold year event that we looked at. The final non-regulatory product that we looked at was a travel time estimator. This was done just for the Animas River. The purpose of the travel time estimator, as I described very early on in the presentation, was to look at how long it would take flow to move between 2 points in the Animas River watershed. This is driven specifically by the Gold King mine spill, which caused a lot of havoc in this area. There's not a ton to report yet on this, as this tool is still under development, but we hope that we'll have something available to show the communities within the next couple months. And we plan to employ or deploy this analysis via a web-based platform where the community can interactively select 2 different points, and using the data available, determine how long it would take for anything that they're interested in to move between 2 locations in the watershed. Thank you all for sitting in on the presentation and for your interest in the non-regulatory products that we ran through. Please direct any questions that you have about the specific non-regulatory products to me, and I'd be happy to dive into any more of the details, since I had to run through these different analyses very quickly. Please also note that on this slide you can see my contact information if you'd like to email me with any other questions. I've also included the contact info for Twee Patton, who's the floodplain program manager at CWCB and was a big driving force in developing these non-regulatory products and sharing them out with the communities. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Isaac. We got some great comments in the chat about the use of your graphics. And we do have a couple of questions. I just wanted to clarify for Anna, who had a question in the chat, who was asking for the USDA data, that Isaac did reply to you within the chat. So just look for that link that he sent you for that information. And the question that we have is the 10-year full burn Q, is that greater than the 500-year?
It was, if I remember correctly, and we had some pretty enormous full burn flows across the 10-year to 500-year events, which were pretty eye-opening, to be honest with you. It was a very, I guess, hypothetical ultra-conservative condition. And so in the end, we actually made a decision not to map that because, one, it would have completely blown up the hydraulic models that we were using, and 2, it's probably a bit beyond what that community might expect to see in the future. So that hydrology was really kind of treated as a data point that we put out, but then we caveated it in the reports and other information that were shared to the community.
Okay, great. We have one more question. And was precipitation included in the Mineral Creek discharge run? And the questioner, Soumya, asks, might that explain the poor validation?
Definitely possible. I think I noted in the presentation that we strictly modeled snowpack decay to get our stream flow curves or stream flow hydrographs. And obviously during any spring, there's the potential for rain on snow events that can contribute to that. So that very well could be what caused the difference. So that would be one thing to maybe tack on in future analyses, but just based on the time constraints that we had for working in this study, we went with basically a simple melt-based approach, but definitely a good point to raise and something to keep in mind for the future.
Okay, great. And it looks like that's all the questions that we have. Thank you so much. And I'm sure if anybody has any additional questions, you can probably contact Isaac via the AECOM booth. You guys have a virtual booth, right?
Please
okay,
stop
fantastic.
by.
That's great. Thank you so much, Isaac. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presentation is Beyond a Line on a Map, How to Enhance Coastal Resiliency Along Eroding Shorelines in New England. And that's co-presented by Brian Caufield, Senior Coastal Engineer, and Timothy Adams, Water Resources Engineer, both at CDM Smith.
Thank you for joining us as we're going to be talking about Beyond a Line on a Map, where we're looking at increasing coastal resiliency along the eroding shorelines of New England. I'm co-presenting today with Tim Adams, but without the help of Elna Dre Horgan, Jeremy Mull, and Lauren Klonsky, we would not be where we're at today. The purpose and objectives of the study is that we know coastal erosion is happening and that it threatens lives, property, and resources along the coastlines. We know that there's an expectation of sea level rise, and with these future sea level rise, erosion is going to potentially increase, putting more areas at risk. And so the thought process is, let's look into developing a non-regulatory product such as these coastal erosion hazard maps that can help communities plan for future erosion and begin to develop adaptation strategies. So this all goes back to 2015 when the Technical Mapping Advisory Council told FEMA that they should look into the impacts of both sea level rise and coastal erosion on the overall changes to coastal flood risks. And this even references back to 2009 Heinz Center study that mentioned that erosion is a negative impact on the National Flood Insurance Program, and that FEMA should do more to investigate coastal erosion. We've seen from a U.S. Coastal Resilience Toolkit from 2019, some of the numbers represented there is that there's about $500 million a year that is being lost in coastal property, including damages to structure and loss of land. We know that we're putting about $150 million a year into beach nourishment and other type of shoreline erosion control methods, and we're losing annually about 80,000 acres of coastal wetlands a year. So we know that there have been several local and regional studies of sea level rise and coastal erosion, but as far as we know, there's no similar study size and magnitude of what we're doing right now in the New England area. Most of the states have existing sea level rise and inundation mapping, and they have current long-term erosion maps, but they don't have that combination of the two, sea level rise and future shoreline retreat. So, and then the other issue that we know happens in New England is that there are these areas that have high coastal bluffs. And so along those coastal bluffs, you're going to see a retreat that's really not captured in some of these long-term erosion rates. It's a different process that hasn't been mapped out at this point in time. And the expectation is there's going to be future risks there as well. So to give you an idea of the products we're trying to develop, showing you on the left-hand side is, we can show the areas that are at risk of erosion. We're not projecting this is the future position of the shoreline. We're saying that this area is at risk of eroding. We do it on a transect-based analysis. We look at providing a sea level rise scenario with future time horizons, and we can provide the data in a geodatabase that we can use through a viewer, so people can go to like our maps online and be able to find something. The other thing we're trying to do is we've developed at least one set of panels based on a single sea level rise scenario with the future 3 time horizons. We've been doing this work over 1,400 miles of shoreline across New England, all the way up through parts of Maine, down and around through Massachusetts, the Cape and the Islands, and then along even the Long Island seashore and the state of Connecticut. There are some other studies and guidance out there. You can access the USGS has their National Shoreline Assessment tool. You can access that online. FEMA Region 9 has a sea level rise pilot study. The state of New York actually has the coastal erosion hazard maps that they use as part of their permitting program. And then on the Pacific coast, USGS has been using this Cosmos modeling system to evaluate shoreline change. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tim to talk about the technical methodology.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So like Brian said, I'm going to talk about the technical methodology here and show you kind of how we get some projections of future coastal erosion. So we're really looking at 2 different things. One, we're calculating, like many of these other studies, a historical trend in shoreline change. We're calculating a historical erosion rate. And then we are modifying that rate to account for sea level rise. And that's really where the new thing that we're doing in this study is coming from. So we're analyzing 3 different time frames, 2030, 2050, and 2100. And these are to meet different needs depending on the specific community member. So 2030 is really just intended for someone who's interested in the short term, what's going to happen next couple of years. 2050 is intended for a homeowner or someone who is looking to be a homeowner, and they're looking at a 30-year mortgage and they're trying to understand what's my relative amount of risk that I'm experiencing due to erosion. And then 2100 is for those who are looking long range, maybe a town planner or someone, where are my areas of greatest need. So this is an overview of our methodology. We, like Brian said, start with transect layouts. We develop a set of transects that we'll perform our analysis on. And then once we classify those transects by the shore type, we'll analyze them differently depending on the type of shore type they are. So for everything, we're looking at a historical erosion rate, and we're calculating that historical erosion rate, but that's going to differ depending on if you have a beach, a sandy beach, or if you have dunes, versus if you have, for instance, coastal bluffs. And so I'm going to focus on that first box up top first and talk about how we get the historical erosion rates, and then we'll talk about how we incorporate sea level rise. So the transects that we place are, there's a lot of them. We place about 1 every 50 meters. And so for 40 miles of coastline in Plymouth and Norfolk counties in Massachusetts, we have almost 2,000 transects. And so we're performing our analysis on each one of these transects. Once we grab them, we're going to extract the cross-shore profiles, the elevation bathymetry along each of those transects. And we grab the LiDAR data from 2010 in the New England area instead of maybe something that's a little bit more recent. And the reason for that is because of Hurricane Sandy, which had a large impact on the coastline in 2012. And what we're interested in this study is the long-term erosion rate, what's going to happen over many, many years. And we don't necessarily want to start with a baseline condition that is abnormally affected by one particular large storm. So we use the 2010 data, and this is the base for all of our future projections. Now that we have that elevation data, will identify the NPF, or the natural protective feature. And this natural protective feature is basically the point on the profile on the transect where landward of that point there's not much erosion. You can think of it basically as the edge of erosion that's occurred up until the present moment. So generally, especially on a sandy dune, that would be on the most seaward dune crest, and it's generally vegetated because everything seaward of that NPF is being impacted by erosion, so it's hard for vegetation to take hold. But landward of that crest, there's space and time for vegetation to get a foothold. So we'll identify that for sandy dunes. We'll identify our sandy beaches, which have a similar type of characteristic, but slightly different. And then we'll also do it for coastal bluffs. And for coastal bluffs, the NPF is basically the place where you don't want to fall off. It's that bluff edge. And that bluff edge is what we're going to be using as the baseline for our future projections. So once we've done this, we have conducted, we've established a baseline of where the shoreline is right now. And now we want to see where the shoreline has been in the past so we can get a historical erosion rate. So for beaches and dunes, generally we can get this data from the USGS or from states. And so for instance, for Massachusetts, we can get it from CZM, which is the Office of Coastal Zone Management, and that they provide a file which provides historical shorelines. That file is derived from a variety of resources, which might include NOAA T-sheets, might include historical aerial imagery, or it might include LiDAR for even recent years. And so we can leverage that data, but there's one thing that we have to think about when we're doing that, and that's making sure that we're doing an apples to apples comparison. So some of the data, most of the data that we'll get from a source like that is tracking the high water line, basically the place where you'd see wave setup and run up to go. And this is very easy to see, or relatively easy to see on on aerial photography, or if you're going out into the field. And so that's typically what's presented in this historical data. But with our baseline condition, or 2010 data, we are going to find the mean high water, which is a specific elevation that we can get from a local tidal gauge. And that's very easy to find on a profile because we just plug in that elevation. So we need to account for the difference between the high water line and the mean high water. And we'll leverage USGS data. In the past, we've primarily done that to account for that datum bias. So when we're comparing historical shorelines, we're comparing something that's they're meaningful to each other. So once we have meaningful shorelines that we can compare, we'll plot the positions of those shorelines across the transect over time, and we'll do a linear regression, and we'll get a long-term erosion rate. And this is our number for each transect. The slope of this line is the erosion rate that we have seen in the past. So we can do this for beaches and dunes. We can also do it for bluffs. And for bluffs, like we had said before, that the NPF is the bluff edge. And so we're going to track that bluff edge through time. So for this, we'll typically have to pull the historical aerial imagery ourselves and manually find that bluff edge. So in 1966, for instance, you can see the red line on the left side. That's the bluff edge for this area in the south part of Plymouth County, Massachusetts. And if you go to 2010, you'll see that there's been meaningful erosion, about 1.5 feet per year. And we'll compare the progression of that bluff edge. We'll do that for a set of images, and just like the beaches and dunes, we'll calculate a we'll do linear regression and calculate a erosion rate long term. So we can do that for each transect, and then we'll get this data across our entire study area. For bluffs, you're only going to see erosion because once a bluff goes, it can't come back. For some beaches, you might actually see, due to local processes, you might see some accretion instead of erosion, which you can see in this graph around transect number 350. So now that we have this historical information, we've got a baseline location, our NPF, that we're going to project our future erosion from, and we have a historical erosion rate. Why don't we just take that historical erosion rate and project it into the future? Well, we know that in the past, we've seen a certain level of sea level rise. For instance, in Boston, it's 2.86 millimeters per year over the past century. That's the rate that we've seen. And we know that there is erosion due to that rising sea. And so what we know from NOAA projections and from other projections is that that sea level rise, that rate of sea level rise, is going to increase into the future. And so we need to accelerate the rate of erosion that occurs due to sea level rise in order to get a more representative understanding of what's going to be happening in the future. If we just took that historical rate and multiplied that projected that into the future, you'd likely see an underestimate of the amount of erosion that a particular area would experience. So we do that for beaches. As the previous slide showed, we can also do that for bluffs, where again, the bluffs are being acted on by the seas, and as sea levels rise, that impacts those bluffs. And as that acceleration occurs in sea level rise, we expect an acceleration of the erosion of the bluff. So there are some places where we have to take more of a hybrid approach. And what that means is you've got a beach which is in front of a bluff, it's backed by a bluff, and that bluff hasn't experienced any erosion in the past. In this picture, in the bottom part of the picture, you see that there's vegetation on that bluff, and it means that that bluff is stable. But we would expect, as in, by 2030, 2050, 2100, that beach is going to erode and that bluff is no longer going to be stable. But we don't have a erosion rate for the bluff at that location in the past because it's been stable. So what we do is we will project the sandy beach erosion up until the current bluff edge. And then from that point forward, we'll use an erosion rate from a bluff that is similar in characteristics nearby. So in this picture, that would be from a bluff that is just a little farther north that we have seen erosion. And so we'd say, okay, we expect that once the bluff starts eroding, it's going to erode similarly to this. And so finally, just looking a little bit more into that sea level rise acceleration, the bottom dotted black line that you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is the sea level rise that you'd expect up until 2100 if you just took the historical sea level rise and put it into the future. So you'd only have about 1/4 of a meter of sea level rise after about 90 years. However, NOAA projects under different emission scenarios a variety of different sea level rise projections up until even 2.5 meters per year. And so what we'll do if we're looking at a particular year, say 2100, is we'll take the slope of the line between that 2100 time period and our baseline year, and we'll compare it with the slope of the line from the past. And that the relative factor between those two lines is the factor that we use as to multiply the effects of sea level rise on erosion. So basically what you're going to see is that as sea level rise accelerates, erosion is going to accelerate. And these projections give us a way of quantifying that. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian again. And Brian's going to talk a little bit about the results that we get from this analysis, and particularly how those connect to the communities that we're serving.
Thanks, Tim. It's great explanations. So now we're going to kind of take and look at the results themselves. And again, as we started at the beginning, we've got the ability to make these plots that you see on the left-hand side, which show the erosion location or distance that's going to happen based on the sea level rise scenario and the expected time horizon, whether it's 2030, 2050, or 2100. And then we can also take that material and turn it into a individual static map. And that map, of course, would just represent one sea level rise scenario with the 3 time horizons. We did look into what it could look like if we included additional sea level rise scenarios, but the maps just got too messy. And so what we really are working on is developing the data into a geodatabase that we can load into an ArcGIS online viewer system so people can go in and choose their own risk level sea level rise scenario and evaluate then what the future conditions could be. We've also done some outreach meetings. We're very early on in kind of the study process. While we were looking at 1,400 miles, so far we've only gotten out into Nantucket County. And part of that is due to this COVID-19. We actually had 2 outreach meetings planned for this month, but we've held back on trying to plan those meetings, 1, due to travel concerns, and 2, because these are non-regulatory products. This isn't something that communities need to adopt or be enforcing. And it's really it takes a lower level status with respect to maintaining the functionality of the communities at this point in time. I do want to explain though kind of the process we've gone through so far. So we went over to Nantucket. It's fairly easy from a community outreach perspective because Nantucket County and the island are one and the same. So it's really just engaging one local community. We were able to engage the Nantucket Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, which was made up of different members of the town, whether it was the airport or Conservation Commission or their planning commission. And we provided the results to them in a meeting. They've asked us to come back and provide a new meeting based on, again, providing the results, but this time not to community officials, but rather the local citizens themselves. And so we're trying to figure out where we can put that into place right now, where that needs to be a virtual meeting while the summer residents happen to be over there. And we're working, of course, then on developing additional outreach material based on some of the questions that have been asked as we've gone into these meetings. And so we just kind of keep working on and developing and improving the process. And with that, we're available for questions.
Thank you so much, Tim and Brian, for a great presentation. We're a little short on time, so I typed in the chat. If you guys have any questions for either Tim or Brian, please go ahead and contact them in the CDM Smith booth. I think we have time just to answer just one question. The question is, could this be applied to riverine flooding causing erosion with more oh no, wait, I'm in the wrong one. With more precipitation and snowmelt entering the river system? That one, sorry.
Yeah, if that is meant for us, I mean, I do think that there's opportunities where you could see that happening. I'm a coastal engineer, so I'm not as familiar with some of the HEC-RAS modeling, but it would seem like you could look at future scenarios and future erosion potential and see then how you could do like HEC-RAS modeling under different flow scenarios. And I think Isaac, the presentation before, kind of showed how that can be done. And so I definitely make sure that would happen.
Anything to add, Tim?
No, I think Brian covered it on that one.
Okay, I think, thank you so much to the two of you for joining us today with this, our presentation and this session. As a reminder, please visit our presenters at their virtual booths. Soumya Sagarika and Farron Affleck at Atkins, Isaac Allen at AECOM, and Brian Caufield and Timothy Adams at CDM Smith. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.